It's an important issue that India is probably, or South Asia, is probably one of the few places where there is no continuity between the two urban civilizations. The one which was there in Harappa, which according to me and certain other people would be argued, and I'm not very important here, not being a historian, would be argued that you see a decline of rainfall and therefore a decline of agricultural production because the production was still largely done using Neolithic tools. Therefore, the surplus was thin. A small drop in surplus would endanger the urban civilizations. It would not be a sharp fall because rainfall does not decrease sharply. It decreases gradually over a period if there is a climate change. And if such a climate change occurs, the cities will slowly shrink. And below a certain number, the city would die. Now, this smaller cities is also visible in Egypt. There is also other civilizations which seem to have faced a similar crisis. They don't have to face it at the same time. It's not that the global climate was so close that everything happened in the same period. You could have climate change which affects certain regions with more rainfall, certain regions with less rainfall. So the various climatic shifts could take place, but there seems to have been a climatic shift from Mesopotamia, Indus Valley to Egypt in this whole region, and there seems to have been a shrinking of the cities, still being argued, and it is called the Megalithic epoch. Because that's where they have found a icicle there are rings from which you can make out the ages, and because that has been found in a cave in Meghalaya, they've called it the Megalithic epoch. So this is where they say the start of a short period of dry age starts, and it seems to correlate somewhat to the fall of certain urban civilizations, roughly in the same period, though not exactly at the same time. So open conjecture, but this is the argument. And then you have a long period in which it's not that in agriculture there's a huge discontinuity. A small drop in agricultural productivity will mean that you will get the fall of the cities, which are based on a narrow surplus. So this means that you get into a situation where the cities will die, but society doesn't change dramatically. So what happens in this? First is trade of elite goods go away. So agriculture can still grow, but the towns and trade, which as we showed earlier in the Harappan times, that trade was really trade in elite goods. It's from town to town elite to town elite. The production carried on in the towns was also for a certain section of the elite. And what you find instead is really relatively self-sufficient agriculture again, without this huge amounts of trade that takes place. And urban cities come up in India after a long period. You come around this period when you start opening out the Ganges Valley. Now here is the important issue. There's a huge amount of debate that is going on in history. The argument is how important is Ganges Valley, opening it to agriculture and iron. Kosambi and R.S. Sharma have both argued that this is really the consequence of discovery of iron. Without discovering iron, you could not have the access which could clear the dense forests which were there, which are dense tropical forests, unlike the Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, that region, which are relatively arid scrub lands. You could not clear these without actually having iron axe. Why is iron different? Iron is much more present on the Earth's crust. Iron is available in much larger quantities and distributed in lots more places. So you don't have to go long distance to find copper, as you had to do in the case of Harappans going to Oman, for instance, and the Egyptians and the Sumerians and the Babylonians going long distances to find copper. So this you don't need. So you can find it reasonably easily in terms of its distribution. We have already seen the pottery kilns. So the ability to make iron is not that difficult, and we'll show you videos which showed that communities, even today, make really iron almost the same way as it was done, say, 2000 years back. So you have that possibility once you get the kiln of reaching temperatures where you can make iron. Iron was not really melted. The melting point of iron is 1650 degrees centigrade. So you don't melt and create molten iron. That's not what you do. When you heat it, what happens, the impurities, they get burnt or they get liquefied, they float to the top. So you get a mass in which the impurities are taken out, and what you get left is something which is close to what you would call iron. But you don't really melt iron. It has impurities which lowers the melting point. As you know, you put salt on ice, it melts because salt percolates the upper surface of ice, mixes with water, and therefore the melting point changes, and then the ice melts. The salt has a much lower freezing temperature than pure water. So iron also has that property that if you put impurities, it starts to show melting behavior. So some melting also takes place, but you don't go to 1650, which is the melting temperature of iron. You don't produce molten iron before the Bessemer furnace. So all of this are still processes by which you can approximate iron, but you don't really control the composition of iron. And I'll come to what the Indians did, which was quite clever. So this is where you have a large number of sites where iron was produced, and you have the Iron Age cities which come up in Rajgir and Pataliputra, which is Rajgir and Patna today. So this is the span at which you see the growth of the Iron Age cities, and you have a whole set of things which these, shall we say, these kingdoms seem to fulfill. Clearing the Gangetic Valley, you need a far more centralized force. That means it was not easy to create the forests. All of these are Kosambi, R.S. Sharma, particularly Kosambi, because I haven't traveled much beyond Kosambi. Kosambi thesis, which I like, that there is the Arthashastra state. A lot of the people have argued Arthashastra was made at different points of time. Does not really reflect the Mauryan state. Kosambi is wrong in its attribution. It's the Mauryan state, it's the Kosambi, the Mauryan state is the Arthashastra state. But his argument is that you need a centralizing force to clear dense Gangetic forests, and therefore the need for a quote-unquote state which could perform this economic task. In the Arthashastra, it's very clear the state had a major role in economy. that it played a lot. Not only did it organize settling people on land, it also organized other economic activity. So both of these are a part of what would be called the Mauryan state. It's very clear the Mauryan state was a far more centralized state than what you see later. This is the range of Ashokan edicts. So you can see that it was a very large area over which he asserted partial control or full control. How much is the core? We don't know, probably something like this. But it is true that he also seemed to have the edicts over all of these places would seem to show that there was either a tributary relationship or an overlord relationship over here. How much was direct control and indirect tribute, we don't know. So this is a very large empire that is there. So the second part of it is this kind of centralized empire we see a lot later. This kind of empire that arises has the difference that you can see a core seat of the empire, which you probably cannot see in Mohenjo-daro, Harappa. Over the Harappan area, you don't see such a strong central empire, centralizing, shall we say, city, which you can call the seat of power. So as we had discussed earlier, that urbanization really requires a coercive instrument, the state, which requires weapons. So here clearly iron is of course the weapons, very clearly. The second part of it, it requires a center from which these activities have to be carried out. This is the rise of the earlier copper Bronze Age towns and now the towns which rise in this period, because this is where the tribute and the organization both go hand in hand, and it becomes a center, as it were, of this organizing activity. So the second part of it is this is the urbanization, and if we look at the architecture, then a lot of them also shows organization, because you have to defend it from outside forces. So you have to have battle ramparts, you have to have a castle area where the so-called head of the state would stay. So you have these various other things that are needed with this kind of centralizing empires. But also you have role now of different classes. So if the possibility of different classes this arise, again, it's important to understand fundamentally the major activity is still agriculture. It's not true that agriculture ceases to be the major activity. Yes, a lot more artifacts are created because iron is relatively more easily available material, so it can be worked much more. There can be much more local use of iron tools. You can get it into plows, you can get it into axe, which are something that came into ordinary use. So there is a large, shall we say, artisanal class that arises, but still the dominant produce of that area, of that era, is still agricultural products. Agricultural production is still the main, and this is the difference between Neolithic agriculture under the Bronze Age and Iron Age agriculture. Is iron enters the plow, axe to clear the forest, and the plow to make agriculture easier. So you have this major change that takes place in the two, where you have these metals therefore play a different role. In that sense, iron enters everyday life in a big way, which bronze and copper never did. So this is also the transformation that takes place. The possibility of surplus increases quite significantly with the rise of iron that you now see. So metals in that sense have a difference, that copper and bronze still narrow elite use. Here you have everyday use, enters agriculture, You have an artisanal community. You had in fact smiths in every village. So it ended because you needed various things to be done. The farmers needed their implements to be sharpened periodically. They broke, they had to be fixed. All of this is done by the village blacksmith in every place that you can think of. And you had this Iron Age cities that arises, the southern part of India, which tends to get left out. So you had essentially the Pandyas, which seem to mention quite a bit in Roman and Greek literature. And you have the Cheras, who are generally neglected, as thought to be not so important. Again, important in external literature. And then you have the Andhras, the Sadvahanas, and the Cholas, which are called the Cholas in a lot of the Greek and Roman accounts. So these are the four, shall we say, major principalities which are mentioned, which also are mentioned in the Sangam literature. The important other part of it, which is interesting for us to note, that writing was not that common. That if you really come to written literature, that even in Ashokan times, you find edicts. This is what you're really seeing, but you don't see much written form. And even initially the script used was Kharoshti. Kharoshti seems to have been a derivative of, the Arabic script? Arabic, A-R-A-M-I-C, Arabic script, which seems to have been used in Afghanistan and this part of the world at that time. So that seems to have been how Kharoshti was used. A lot of you must make a distinction between language and script. The script can be anything. You can write Hindi in Roman, okay? But the language, therefore, is not the script. So Kharoshti is the script, which then is replaced by Brahmi. And you have the northern and the southern Brahmi. The southern Brahmi has a few more of the unpronounceable sounds for the North Indians and the Bengalis, like a ra, ra, and all those kind of sounds, which we can't pronounce. So you get a lot of rock edicts, you get inscriptions, you get epigraphic this stuff, but you don't really get writing. And that's the other part we need to talk about when we deal with the caste system, that India seems to have organized itself a lot more with, shall we say, the spoken word and not the written word. So what they did is they did keep accounts. But the rules, for instance, of accounts were there. A lot of arithmetic was there in how traders had to calculate. So you find the Bhakshali manuscripts are actually manuals for the traders. But the mathematics is mostly carried as oral knowledge. And there the caste system, which India actually starts developing. Very clearly you have the caste system which develops with the Indo-Aryans being there, either taking over something that existed there or it evolving from that point of time, either way. But you get this division of castes where the priestly knowledge is kept through word of mouth. That the easiest way to maintain endogamy and knowledge is basically by restricting it within the family. And therefore you have relatively less text, and you therefore see language which is quite developed. You have Panini's grammar, we have major grammarians who write a lot of this thing about language, but you don't have too much of textual record. It's only later that you see the rise of, shall we say, written texts. And this is very important because almost all historians have said that urbanization generally goes hand in hand with text, writing. And India, it's not that they did not know writing, clearly they did, but most of their accounts are not there in a written form. So how was that knowledge transmitted? Because knowledge obviously is important to maintain all of this. It was transmitted by word of mouth by a community which restricted it within the family or the larger families, shall we say, within which they intermarried. and used knowledge as an instrument of power, which is what Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay calls the heavenly power they did by virtue of retaining it within the caste. There's an interesting historical fact that I want you to know, which is India before the Bessemer furnace had what is called wood steel. And this is a very interesting product because it did what is called crucible steel. After we have the furnace, which is very clear, very similar to what we saw in the kiln furnaces, that this you remelted the iron ore you got in what would be called crucibles. This is a crucible. They're small, not very large. And you packed them with various firing material. You had again a kind of updraft. You had temperatures roughly between 12 to 1400, probably not more than that. But what you produced within that was high carbon steel. Now high carbon steel is very brittle. It cannot be used for swords and so on. So they had worked out a method of tempering, cooling it very quickly. And they had also worked out a method of forging, that is repeated heating and then beating it, which is what forging really is, which changed the texture of or the distribution of the iron particles inside the steel. And that led to what is the Damascus steel, which this is a 1200 AD blade, which you can see this kind of what is called the flowing water patterns. And this is what was known outside as Damascus steel. So your generation probably has not read Walter Scott. My generation did. I'm not so sure of Bapa's. Okay, so there they talk of Saladin and Richard. And Richard is very strong. He severs an iron goat's head with his sword. Okay, it can do that. But Saladin can cut a muslin handkerchief by doing this. Okay, it was much sharper than anything the Europeans had seen. And again in Walter Scott, the Damascus armor is talked about. And there is a line where it says that, you know, if it was an iron forged in England, I'd have pierced that mail. But this is from Damascus, so I couldn't pierce it. So it was superior steel. But that steel, as we now know, came from deep south. And these are the places where wood steel was known. Deccan Hyderabad seems to have developed a slightly different way of doing it. But you had the deeper down in Karnataka, what is currently Karnataka and currently Tamil Nadu, also parts of Kerala, where this woods making seemed to be quite widespread. And this produced ingots, small ingots of this size. This is bulat in Russian, faulad in Persia. So all of this is a major export product from South India. And it goes, a shipload could carry 20,000 of these ingots. That's a number which is very large, which could be carried there. And this was a prize steel and is replaced only in England in 1850s with the Bessemer process. Till that point, this was unrivaled in terms of steel. Let's not give us too much credit. Well, there's an African tribal group which also used a very similar process, and they also produced carbon steel, which was as good as anything Europe was able to produce for the next 1800 years. So yes, these are some of the things which are what I will call artisanal knowledge, which seemed to be widespread here, but wasn't really replicated in Europe. So this is the other interesting tidbit of knowledge that I wanted to share with you, that particularly South India, which we seem to neglect, had preponderance of steel making knowledge, which nobody else at that point of time seemed to have, as I said, till you come to modern Europe.